what everyday life was really like inside Nazi Germany. Good evening, dear friends. When we think of Nazi Germany, our minds often go straight to the front lines, marching armies, shattered cities, and leaders delivering thunderous speeches. But most people did not live on the battlefield. They lived in apartments, stood in grocery lines, sent children to school, and tried to build ordinary lives inside an extraordinary system. By 1941, while the war expanded across Europe, radios in German homes still reported progress, factories still operated, and streets still filled each morning. To the outside world, Germany appeared unified and disciplined. But beneath that surface was a daily reality shaped by surveillance, pressure, reward, and fear. A reality few histories pause to examine. Tonight's story is not about soldiers or generals. It is about civilians. About how everyday life functioned inside a totalitarian state, and how normal routines slowly adapted to extraordinary control, until obedience felt less like coercion and more like survival. For the average German civilian, life under the Nazi regime was not defined by constant spectacle or unbroken terror. It was shaped by gradual change. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, many Germans were exhausted by years of instability, unemployment, and the lingering trauma of the First World War. The promise of order, work, and national renewal appealed to a society searching for certainty. In the early years, daily life appeared to improve. Large public works projects reduced unemployment and restored a sense of purpose. Factories reopened, infrastructure expanded, and wages became more predictable. State-run organizations offered subsidized vacations, cultural events, and recreational programs. These benefits were carefully designed. They linked personal stability to political loyalty, making the regime feel not only powerful, but useful. Yet this stability came with strict conditions. Independent labor unions were dissolved and replaced by state-controlled bodies. Workers no longer negotiated, they complied. Working hours increased while wages were fixed. Small businesses struggled under new regulations, and many closed. Economic security existed, but only within boundaries drawn by the state. Totalitarian control did not rely solely on force. It embedded itself into routine. Radios became a constant presence in homes, carrying official messages into everyday life. Schools revised curricula to emphasize ideology alongside traditional subjects. Children learned early which ideas were acceptable and which were dangerous to voice. Youth organizations played a central role in shaping identity. Boys and girls were encouraged, and eventually required, to join state-sponsored groups that framed discipline and conformity as virtues. These programs offered camaraderie, structure, and belonging. Over time, loyalty shifted away from family and toward the state. Parents often complied, not out of enthusiasm, but because refusal carried consequences. Marriage and family life were also drawn into the system. Couples received incentives for marrying and having children, framed as contributions to the nation's future. At the same time, private life became increasingly monitored. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious behavior. Casual remarks, jokes, or criticisms could result in investigation. Silence became a survival strategy. By the late 1930s, rationing began to affect daily life. Food and clothing grew scarcer as resources were redirected toward rearmament and war. Households adapted creatively, masking shortages with routine and presentation. Life continued, but it narrowed. Choice diminished. Flexibility disappeared. Women's roles reflected a deep contradiction. Official messaging emphasized domestic ideals, portraying women as caretakers of home and family. Yet economic expansion and later wartime necessity brought millions of women into factories and offices. This contradiction was never openly acknowledged. Instead, it was framed as temporary service to the nation. Cultural life was reshaped to reflect approved values. Art, music, and sport were placed under strict oversight. Public events became carefully choreographed displays of unity and strength. Attendance was expected. Participation signaled conformity, not necessarily belief. Despite this pervasive control, enthusiasm was far from universal. Many civilians adopted a strategy of withdrawal. They focused on work, family, and private routines, avoiding political discussion whenever possible. Historians describe this as a retreat into the personal sphere. It was not resistance, but adaptation. Fear played a decisive role. The legal system was fully subordinated to the regime. Penalties expanded dramatically, and enforcement was unpredictable. Awareness of risk did not require direct experience. The knowledge that punishment could be arbitrary was enough to shape behavior. As the war intensified, civilian life grew harsher. Air raids forced families into shelters. Cities were damaged. Displacement became common. Men were sent to the front, while women, children, and the elderly maintained what remained of daily life. Normality persisted, but it was fragile. One of the most difficult questions surrounding civilian life concerns awareness. How much did ordinary Germans know about the regime's actions beyond their neighborhoods? Accounts suggest that rumors circulated widely. People sensed that something was happening. But fear discouraged inquiry. Not knowing became a form of protection. After 1942, as the war turned against Germany, survival replaced belief. Shortages worsened. Bombing intensified. Optimism faded. Loyalty became quieter and more pragmatic. Many civilians no longer asked whether the system was right. They asked whether they could endure it. Yet even in this environment, daily life continued. Children attended school. Factories reopened after air raids. Markets resumed. Weddings took place under blackout curtains. These routines did not signal approval. They signaled adaptation. Life under the Nazi regime was neither constant terror nor universal fanaticism. It was layered. It combined incentives with restrictions, fear with routine, and ideology with habit. The system relied not only on violence, but on participation and silence. This complexity matters. It challenges the idea that history divides neatly into villains and victims. Civilian life under totalitarianism exists in gray spaces, where compromise becomes routine and resistance carries unbearable cost. Understanding that reality does not excuse the past. It explains how control can become ordinary, how freedom can erode without dramatic collapse, and how daily life can continue even as moral boundaries narrow. The experience of German civilians under the Nazi regime reminds us that oppression does not always arrive with chaos. Sometimes it arrives with order, reassurance, and routine. And once embedded in everyday life, it becomes far harder to recognize, and even harder to escape. Life under the Nazi regime shows us that oppression does not always arrive with chaos. Sometimes it arrives with order, routine, and reassurance, until those same structures make escape nearly impossible. Most civilians were not architects of the system, but they lived within it, adapted to it, and survived by navigating its boundaries. Their experience reminds us that daily life can continue even as freedom disappears, and that normality can coexist with profound moral compromise. The question this history leaves us with is not simply what people believed, but what they accepted and why. Because when control becomes routine, silence becomes safety, and survival becomes priority, the line between choice and coercion quietly erodes. Understanding that reality does not excuse the past, it helps us recognize how easily it can return. Not through sudden collapse, but through gradual accommodation, one ordinary day at a time.